Most human suffering does not begin in the outside world. It begins in the silent agreement between a person and their own thoughts. A thought appears, and instead of observing it, the mind accepts it as truth. A thought whispers doubt, and immediately the body reacts as if the doubt is already reality. A thought projects fear, and suddenly the future feels like a place you are already trapped in. But what is rarely understood is that a thought is not an authority. It is not a command. It is not even a fact. It is simply movement in consciousness, passing through, like wind through an open space. You are not the thought that appears. You are the awareness that notices the thought appearing. This distinction changes everything, yet it is the most ignored truth in human experience. The mind will generate thousands of thoughts in a single day, some logical, some emotional, some completely imaginary. If a person believes each one, they become unstable inside themselves because they are constantly shifting identity based on whatever thought is currently active. Stress begins at this exact point of identification. The moment you say, "This thought is me," you give it weight, you give it emotion, you give it control over your nervous system. A simple mental sentence like, "I am not good enough," is not dangerous by itself, but when it is believed, it becomes a chemical reaction in the body. The breath changes, the posture changes, the focus narrows. A mental image that does not exist in reality begins to shape physical experience. But if you observe the same thought without attachment, something different happens. The thought still appears, but it loses authority. It moves through the mind like an object, passing through space, without becoming your identity. You begin to notice that thoughts come and go on their own, without permission, without structure, without consistency. Some are based on memory, some are based on fear, some are random noise created by overstimulation. None of them require obedience. The problem is not that thoughts exist. The problem is that attention is constantly merged with them. The mind becomes so familiar with its own activity that it forgets the presence behind it. Like watching a movie so closely that you forget you are sitting in a theater, the illusion becomes total. You react to every scene as if it is happening to you, even though you are only witnessing light on a screen. Detachment does not mean suppression. It does not mean fighting thoughts or forcing silence. It means allowing thoughts to exist without becoming entangled in their narrative. A thought can be seen without being followed. A fear can be noticed without being obeyed. A memory can arise without becoming a story that defines your present moment. When this understanding becomes experiential, the inner space begins to widen. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer compress your awareness. The mind continues to produce noise, but you are no longer reduced to that noise. There is a silent background that remains untouched, even while mental activity continues. In that silent background, reaction slows down. Interpretation becomes optional rather than automatic. The urgency that once dominated the mind begins to weaken, not because thoughts disappear, but because identification dissolves. You start to see that the thinker is not fixed. It is a process, not a person. And in that recognition, something in the structure of inner experience begins to shift. Stress is often believed to be a direct response to external pressure, but in reality, it is formed in the space between what is happening and how the mind interprets it. The situation itself is neutral until the mind assigns meaning to it. That meaning is where tension is created. Two people can stand in the same environment, face the same challenge, hear the same criticism, or experience the same uncertainty. Yet their internal experience can be completely different. One remains grounded while the other collapses inward. The difference is not the event, but the resistance formed inside perception. Resistance is the hidden mechanism behind stress. It is the silent refusal to accept what is already present. When reality is happening in one direction and the mind insists it should be happening in another, friction is created. That friction is experienced as emotional pressure, mental exhaustion, and physical strain. The mind begins to argue with what is, even though what is already happening cannot be changed by argument alone. This internal conflict consumes energy continuously, and that consumption is what people label as stress. Most individuals try to reduce stress by changing external conditions, believing that if the environment becomes easier, the mind will automatically become calm. But even in easier circumstances, the same pattern returns if resistance remains active. A person can achieve success and still feel overwhelmed. They can gain comfort and still feel anxious. They can remove problems and still create new ones internally. This reveals that stress is not dependent on difficulty, but on opposition to experience. When the mind resists, it creates separation between itself and the present moment. Instead of being fully engaged with what is happening, attention is divided. Part of awareness is in reality, while another part is fighting reality. This division creates instability. Energy that could be used for clarity, action, and presence is instead used to maintain internal argument. The result is fatigue that does not come from physical effort, but from mental struggle. If resistance is observed closely, it is always based on comparison. The mind compares what is happening with what it expected, what it desired, or what it feared. These comparisons form invisible standards that reality is constantly measured against. When reality does not match those internal standards, rejection begins. That rejection is subtle but continuous. It appears as impatience, frustration, worry, or impatience with timing. Yet none of these reactions change the situation. They only intensify the inner experience of pressure. When resistance begins to dissolve, something fundamental shifts. Acceptance does not mean approval, and it does not mean passivity. It simply means no longer adding internal struggle to what already exists. The mind begins to see the situation clearly without immediately trying to rewrite it. In that clarity, energy that was previously used for opposition becomes available for response. Action becomes more precise because it is no longer clouded by emotional resistance. Stress thrives in mental time travel, where the mind constantly moves between this should not be happening and what if it gets worse. Both directions pull awareness away from the present moment. The present moment, however, is the only place where action is possible. When attention returns to what is actually occurring right now, rather than what is imagined about it, the intensity of stress begins to reduce naturally. Without force, the situation remains the same. But the internal relationship to it changes, and that change alters the entire experience of pressure and emotional weight. When the mind enters anxiety, it accelerates beyond the natural rhythm of the body. Thoughts become faster than breath. Imagination becomes more dominant than perception, and the nervous system begins to respond as if an emergency is occurring even when there is no immediate danger present. In this state, the body is no longer guided by reality but by interpretation. And interpretation is often shaped by fear, anticipation, and past memory rather than what is actually happening in the present moment. Breathing is the one function of the human system that is both automatic and controllable. It exists at the intersection between conscious awareness and unconscious regulation. This makes it a direct gateway to influence the state of the entire nervous system. When breathing becomes shallow and rapid, the body interprets it as a signal of threat, even if no external threat exists. When breathing becomes slow and steady, the body receives a completely different message, one of safety and stability. Anxiety is not only a mental experience, it is a physiological loop. The mind generates a fearful thought. The body reacts with tension. the breath shortens, and that shortened breath feeds back into the mind, reinforcing the sense of danger. This loop continues until something interrupts it. Without interruption, the cycle becomes self-sustaining, and the individual feels trapped inside their own internal reactions. The interruption does not need to be complex. It begins with awareness of breath. When attention is placed on breathing, the automatic cycle is disrupted. The mind cannot fully maintain imagined fear, while simultaneously observing the physical rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. Awareness becomes anchored in something real, something happening in the present moment rather than in projected scenarios. As the breath slows, the nervous system receives a new signal. The heart rate begins to regulate, muscle tension reduces, and the mental intensity gradually softens. Most people underestimate the simplicity of this process because the mind is conditioned to seek complex solutions for internal discomfort. It believes that something as subtle as breathing cannot possibly resolve something as overwhelming as anxiety. Yet, anxiety is sustained by speed, and breath is the most direct way to reduce speed from within. When exhalation becomes longer than inhalation, the body activates a relaxation response. This is not imagination, it is biological regulation. The breath also serves as an anchor for awareness. Without an anchor, the mind drifts into uncontrolled thought patterns, continuously projecting possible outcomes and worst-case scenarios. With breath as a focal point, attention gains structure. Instead of scattering into multiple directions, awareness returns repeatedly to a single point of reference. This repetition is not about forcing silence in the mind, but about stabilizing attention so that thoughts no longer dominate the entire field of experience. As breathing deepens, the boundary between observer and experience becomes clearer. Thoughts may still arise, but they are no longer fused with physical reaction in the same immediate way. There is a gap created between stimulus and response. In that gap, choice becomes possible. Instead of reacting automatically to every thought, the individual begins to witness thoughts while maintaining physiological calmness. This shift is subtle at first, but over time it changes the baseline state of the nervous system. The body learns that not every internal signal requires alarm. The mind learns that urgency is not always necessary. Gradually, the system stops overreacting to internal noise, and stability becomes more accessible, even during external uncertainty. In this way, breath is not merely a survival function, but a tool of regulation that connects awareness, body, and present experience into a unified state of calm responsiveness. Stillness is not a natural state for the modern mind. It is a trained capacity. The human system is constantly stimulated by movement, information, expectation, and reaction, which makes silence feel unfamiliar and even uncomfortable at first. When the mind is not engaged in external activity, it tends to turn inward and generate its own noise. This is why many people avoid stillness without realizing they are avoiding the very condition that could restore balance within them. The absence of distraction exposes the patterns that are normally hidden beneath constant activity. Training stillness begins with the simple act of remaining present without reacting to every internal impulse. The mind will continue to produce thoughts, sensations, memories, and projections, but the practice is not to eliminate them. The practice is to observe them without immediately responding. In the beginning, this can feel like instability because attention is no longer being pulled outward and the internal landscape becomes more visible. What was previously ignored begins to surface, and the mind may interpret this as discomfort, when in reality it is awareness becoming clearer. Stillness is often misunderstood as emptiness, but it is not emptiness. It is awareness without interference. The difference is subtle but important. Emptiness suggests absence, while stillness suggests presence without distortion. When a person sits quietly and observes their mind, they may initially believe they are doing nothing, but internally, a deep process of reorganization is occurring. The nervous system begins to shift out of constant reactivity, and the habitual patterns of mental movement are no longer reinforced at the same speed. The mind is conditioned to move continuously because movement creates the illusion of control. Thinking feels like solving, even when thinking is not producing resolution. This constant mental motion becomes addictive because it prevents direct confrontation with inner noise. Stillness interrupts that addiction. It removes the constant input-output cycle and forces awareness to rest in itself without external validation or internal distraction. At first, the resistance to stillness is strong. The body may feel restless, the mind may become impatient, and thoughts may increase in intensity. This is not failure, it is transition. The system is adjusting to a new frequency of experience where stimulation is no longer driving awareness. If this phase is observed without escape, something begins to change beneath the surface. The mind gradually recognizes that it does not need to constantly generate activity to maintain identity. Stillness also reveals the difference between awareness and thought. When attention is fully immersed in thinking, there is no separation between observer and content. Everything feels like one continuous stream. But when stillness is practiced consistently, a natural separation begins to emerge. Thoughts continue, but they are seen rather than inhabited. This shift creates space where reaction is no longer automatic, and perception becomes more refined. Training stillness is not about escaping life, it is about stabilizing the inner system so that life is no longer interpreted through distortion. A reactive mind exaggerates problems, amplifies fear, and distorts perception. A still mind sees more clearly, responds more precisely, and wastes less energy on unnecessary internal conflict. Stillness becomes a foundation for clarity, not a withdrawal from responsibility. With continued practice, the mind begins to recognize that silence is not emptiness to be filled, but stability to be returned to. And in that recognition, awareness begins to rest more naturally in itself, without effort, without urgency, without needing to move into the next thought or the next reaction or the next internal direction. Fear does not survive on truth, it survives on attention. It grows in the space where imagination is given more authority than reality, where possibilities are treated as certainties, and where mental projection is mistaken for actual experience. Most people believe fear is something that attacks them from the outside, but in reality, fear is continuously being generated and sustained from within through patterns of thinking that are rarely questioned. It is not the presence of danger that creates constant fear, but the repeated mental rehearsal of danger that may never occur. Overthinking is the primary fuel of fear. When the mind repeatedly simulates negative outcomes, it begins to react emotionally as if those outcomes are already happening. The body does not differentiate between real events and vividly imagined ones when the emotional intensity becomes strong enough. This is why imagined problems can produce real physical symptoms such as tension, restlessness, and fatigue. The system becomes conditioned to respond to thoughts as if they are events, and in that conditioning, fear becomes habitual. Feeding fear does not always look dramatic. It often appears as small, repetitive mental behaviors, replaying conversations, predicting rejection, imagining failure, rehearsing worst-case scenarios, and constantly scanning for what could go wrong. Each of these mental actions seems harmless in isolation, but together they form a continuous loop that reinforces a sense of threat. The mind begins to believe it is being responsible by thinking this way, when in reality it is strengthening the very pattern it is trying to avoid. Fear gains strength through repetition. Every time a fearful thought is entertained without challenge, it leaves a deeper imprint in the mental structure. The more it is rehearsed, the more automatic it becomes. Eventually, fear no longer needs a trigger from the outside world. It begins to arise on its own, even in safe environments. At that point, fear is no longer a response to reality, but a conditioned habit of perception. To stop feeding fear, attention must be withdrawn from an unnecessary mental engagement. This does not mean forcing the mind to become empty, but rather refusing to participate in thoughts that have no direct relevance to the present moment. When a fearful projection appears, it does not require analysis or expansion. It only requires recognition. The moment it is seen clearly as a thought rather than a truth, its influence begins to weaken. Action is another way fear is starved. Fear grows in inactivity because inactivity gives space for imagination to dominate perception. When appropriate action is taken in the present moment, even in small steps, attention shifts from imagined outcomes to real experience. The mind becomes anchored in what is being done rather than what could happen. This shift interrupts the internal narrative that sustains fear. Fear also depends on delay. The longer something is postponed in the mind, the larger and more distorted it becomes. Immediate engagement with reality reduces the space in which fear can expand. When attention is directed toward what is actually required now, rather than what might be required later, the emotional charge decreases naturally. Observing fear without feeding it is a subtle but powerful discipline. It involves noticing the presence of fear without adding additional thought layers to it. No justification, no rejection, no expansion, just awareness. In that observation, fear loses momentum because it is no longer being continuously reinforced by interpretation over time. The mind begins to learn that it does not need to follow every fearful signal to remain safe. It starts to differentiate between useful caution and unnecessary projection. And in that differentiation, mental space begins to open where clarity replaces anticipation and presence replaces imagined threat. Peace is often misunderstood as a final achievement, something that will arrive once external conditions are perfectly arranged, once problems are solved, once uncertainty disappears, or once life becomes predictable and controlled. But this expectation itself creates suffering because it places peace in a future that never fully arrives. Life continues to shift, circumstances continue to change, and uncertainty remains a permanent feature of existence. If peace depends on the absence of change, then peace will always remain out of reach. Peace is not the absence of disturbance. It is the absence of internal resistance to disturbance. Life will always contain movement, challenges, and unpredictability, but the inner experience of those events depends on the state of the mind encountering them. A reactive mind transforms small situations into emotional turbulence, while a stable mind processes even difficult situations with clarity and balance. The external world is not the determining factor. The internal response is, when peace is treated as a destination, the mind begins to chase conditions. It believes that once certain goals are reached or certain problems are removed, a permanent state of calm will appear. But even after achieving what was once desired, the mind quickly adapts and begins to search for new conditions to satisfy. This cycle reveals that external fulfillment alone cannot produce lasting inner stability. The mind is not designed to settle permanently in outcomes. It is designed to move through experience. Peace, therefore, must be understood as a practice embedded in daily perception rather than a reward at the end of struggle. It is developed in how attention is directed in each moment, how thoughts are observed, how emotions are processed, and how reactions are managed. Every moment presents an opportunity to either reinforce inner chaos or cultivate inner balance. The accumulation of these small choices shapes the overall state of mind more than any single external achievement. A practiced mind learns to pause before reacting. That pause creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, automatic reactions lose dominance, and conscious awareness becomes active. Without that space, every event immediately triggers emotional escalation. With that space, the mind gains the ability to choose interpretation rather than being controlled by it. This choice is the foundation of inner stability. Peace also emerges when the mind stops demanding that reality match expectation in every moment. Expectations create tension because they set rigid conditions for how life should unfold. When reality deviates from those internal models, friction arises. Letting go of rigid expectation does not mean abandoning direction. It means releasing the need for constant alignment between imagination and experience. This flexibility reduces internal conflict and allows life to unfold without continuous resistance. Another dimension of peace is acceptance of impermanence. Everything that exists in experience is in a constant state of change. Emotions rise and fall, thoughts appear and disappear, circumstances evolve, and even identity shifts over time. When the mind resists this natural flow, it creates suffering. When it aligns with it, stability arises not from holding things still, but from understanding that movement itself is the nature of reality. Peace is strengthened through repeated return to presence. The mind will continuously drift into past interpretation or future projection, but each return to the present moment resets awareness. Over time, this repeated return becomes a stabilizing pattern. Instead of being permanently absorbed in mental narratives, awareness learns to rest more frequently in direct experience. In this way, peace becomes less about reaching a final condition and more about the continuous refinement of how reality is met in each unfolding moment. Everything you have been searching for outside has always been pointing you back inward. Stress was never just a pressure, anxiety was never just fear, and peace was never something missing from your life. It was always your relationship with your own mind that shaped your experience of reality. When you stop becoming every thought, when you stop resisting every situation, when you return to your breath, when you train stillness instead of escaping discomfort, when you stop feeding fear through imagination, something begins to shift at the core of your awareness. Life does not necessarily become easier, but your inner state stops being controlled by every movement of life. You begin to realize that freedom is not the absence of problems, but the absence of inner chaos while problems exist. You are no longer trying to eliminate every disturbance, but learning how to remain centered within it. And in that centering, clarity replaces confusion, response replaces reaction, and awareness replaces identification. What once felt overwhelming starts to lose its authority. What once controlled your emotions begins to lose its grip. Not because the world changed, but because you did.